If I were to ask you who are the 4 queens to define RuPaul's Drag Race, who would you pick? It's honestly a harder question than even I expected. There are so many viable queens for this top 4, and having to narrow it down was not easy. Should you go with more OG picks? Should you go with queens that have a lot of prospects for the future that are a lot newer to the show? There's no real right answer, but if we're crafting a sort of Mount Rushmore for Drag Race, I think these picks make the most sense to me. Of course, just want to say the history behind Mount Rushmore is not the best. I'm just using this as a template and it's nothing more or less than that. I'm looking for queens who hit a lot of the bases for what makes Drag Race so special. These queens are able to highlight the different talents needed to be a really successful drag queen, and they're also great characters to follow on TV and in other media as well. The 4 picks are representative of artists that have found success off the show, while also being able to showcase their talents and personality on the show as well. Comment below your picks because I don't think we're all gonna agree. Like and subscribe, do all the YouTuber stuff, and let's start with the choice that I think is a pretty obvious pick for some people, but other people may disagree. Trixie Mattel is the most successful queen to come out of RuPaul's Drag Race, and it's crazy to see the humble beginnings that she did have. Trixie represents so much of what I'm looking for a list like this. She did decent on her original season, getting eliminated early and then coming back to the competition. And then she went on to win All-Stars 3. But her time in season 7 isn't really what netted her the spot in All-Stars 3. Instead, we have her online presence to thank for that. Much like many of the other season 7 girls, Trixie was a workhorse, and that's persisted up until today, where she's now taking a break, and I hope that break goes well. But she was one of the queens to really focus after the show and take any notoriety that she got from the show and turn it into a legacy and empire. She was really able to put herself out there beyond the original depiction that she had on season 7. People really started to fall in love. She came back for All-Stars 3, and after a lot of crazy things happening on that season, she ended up winning. It's really interesting because after following Trixie for so long and knowing her personality, I think she would have still found a lot of success even if she never went on to win. But her going on to win the season and be really successful outside of the show conveys what the show can really do for the queens, even though it's much harder now to do that. Overall, Trixie represents the capitalization that you can get from Drag Race, and more importantly, the redemption side of things, which is always going to be a very persistent topic. Though we're seeing a much different landscape for the queens who go on the show, it's still admirable to look at Trixie's run as something that still can happen today. Trixie going on to have multiple seasons of her own renovation show, her own cosmetic line, releasing multiple folk albums, having a really successful DJ career. I can really go on and on. It's emblematic of how Drag Race can positively change the lives of the people who go on. Once again, it is harder now, and I do need to acknowledge that, but for a list like this, Trixie is a great representative of the best parts of Drag Race. So let's add Trixie to this Mount Rushmore. Oh wait, I think, yeah, that's better. The next definitive pick I have is also a really obvious choice. It's the queen of all queens herself, Jinkx Monsoon. Jinkx checks off so many of the boxes of what I'm looking for these top 4 queens. She's one of the most well-established characters that we've seen on the show, with one of the best storylines ever in her original season. And then she came back to the all-winner season and dominated the entire competition. Her characterization on the show has always been the perfect jumping off point for anyone who wants to get into Drag Race. She's just an endlessly likable, unique character, and I feel like after All-Stars 7, the world finally started to see that. Jinkx represents a lot of the theatrical side that we get in drag. I feel like so many queens' journeys start out by doing drag in theater, and I feel like Jinkx has been able to hone and capitalize on that art form so much. She's out here selling out theaters in both the productions of Chicago and Little Shop of Horrors, and her acting chops have also landed her roles on shows like Doctor Who. I haven't seen too much of Doctor Who, but I know it's really campy, and I think Jinkx just plays the perfect villain for that show. She started her Drag Race journey as a queen that no one really understood, but now I think people are so receptive to who she is and how her mind works. And to me, that's representative of drag and what Drag Race wants to emulate. I want to touch on some queens that were very close to making this top 4, but I decided not yet, or maybe there was a different option, things like that. I made a post in my community tab about a year ago at this point asking this question, and there was rightfully a lot of love for Sasha Colby. If we're talking about impactful things in the drag community, of course Sasha would be on this Mount Rushmore, but I think there needs to be a little more time before we definitively put her on something like this. She is just such a good presence in the community and on the show in general, and I feel like she can be asked back for so many different things. Whether it be guest spots on future seasons, World of Wonder shows, anything, just give them to her. But for right now, I still think it's a little too soon. Alaska was also a name that popped up a lot, and it makes a ton of sense. She's always really established herself as the expert on Drag Race, and I do believe that wholeheartedly. I love that years later, she is still as much of a fan of Drag Race as she was before she was on the show. Not to mention, she won the most iconic and loved season of all time. If I made this list a couple years ago, like when I started my channel, I think she would for sure be on here. It's not that she ever became less of a viable pick, I think other queens in recent years have just really rose their rankings. Like even a couple years ago, I could see her being put over someone like Jinx maybe. I think All-Star 7 is one that I really shook up who I think I would put on here. I'll get back to a couple of queens who barely missed the list, but speaking of All-Star 7, it might be controversial, but I do think I would put Raja on this Mount Rushmore. I and many other creators often talk about how Raja redefined the runway. Her runways on her original season were great, and a lot of them still hold up. I feel like a comment I see nowadays is that her runways are overrated or overhyped, or they don't understand the influence that she had, and a lot of the time it's because they're looking through the lens of today's standards. Drag Race before Raja had some really great looks, but I feel like she was the first to elevate them to a new level. Every time she went into a runway, you didn't know what to expect, but you were excited to see it, and her interpretations of the category were often very out of the box or just, again, elevated. She's basically what Michelle Obama said, constantly raising the bar and doing it flawlessly. And All-Star 7, I think, re-solidified the legacy that she had and her talents just going forward. She brings not only the fashion and the reference to Drag Race, but also the out-of-the-box style needed to be a really great drag artist. The influences she's had on so many different queens who have gone on to be on the show or just queens in general, it's really monumental, and I think she needs to be on this list. Speaking of people who had a lot of influence and are still very influential today, getting back into the people who barely missed the list, let's talk about Raja's counterpart, Raven. Raven is so close to being on this list for me. The amount of queens that she's influenced to be queens, the amount of makeup that she's affected, there's a whole era that was just based off of her makeup. She's had a ton of influence on and off the show. I mean, she still does Rue's makeup now. If a queen from the show were to do a list like this, I'm pretty sure Raven would be on it for them. She just has a lot of pull and influence behind the scenes that I think a lot of the queens would understand, but when we're looking at the people who represent the successes of Drag Race on and off the show, I just don't think she would pop up as much as these four queens. I still do think she deserves to be in the conversation because of her influences and her great work behind the scenes. Bibi Zahara Benet is another name that popped up a lot, and I definitely see the logic behind putting her on here. She's the first winner, the first to do it, and do it extremely well. I feel like there's a really organic love that's grown for Bibi from these newer fans, especially after we get further and further from All Stars 3, where her depiction was not the most consistently great. She's definitely a really good candidate to consider, and if I was looking at some of the different factors, I think she would be a surefire pick for the list, but what I'm looking for right now just doesn't line up as much. Monet Exchange is another really great choice because she's done the Drag Race circuit so many times, and I don't want to lump them together, but Trinity is the same way. The frequency that they pop up on the show is definitely a reason that they could be on this list, and it really does seem like World of Wonder loves them a ton. For me, there's just some overlap with the top four that prevents them from also being on the list. Violet is another queen that was mentioned, also Gottmik as well, both being killer on the runway and having a lot of storyline around their fashion. They're good picks, but again, there's overlap with Raja's role. And though I would never put her on the list, I think Sharon Needles had a ton of influence on a lot of great queens, but her actions are disgusting, and I do not want to promote that ever. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the battle of two New York queens, Bianca Del Rio and Bob the Drag Queen. They're both incredibly intelligent and professional comedians who dominated their original season. Bianca was the first queen to never land below safe on the show. They've both hosted the pit stop and had a pretty consistent relationship with WoW, even if a lot of us were worried that Bob the Drag Queen pissed them off by doing the All-Star 7 reunion. Bianca has had a really consistent comedy tour that has sold out theaters across the world. Bob has produced multiple successful comedy specials. Bianca has starred in 2 movies about her drag character. Bob the Drag Queen is touring with Madonna, going all over the world and going to places like Brazil, performing for 1.6 million people. Like I said at the top of the video, there's no wrong choice, but if I had to choose, I would choose Bob. Because I think linkage to the show is a big factor, and while they've both done things like hosted the pit stop, like I said, Bob also has the podcast and still keeps up to date with Drag Race. When we see the frequency that Bob talks about the show, she's constantly in the fans' minds of someone who is on Drag Race. And I think just that little bit gives her a leg up on Bianca to be our 4th and final person on this Mount Rushmore. Each of these queens, though there seems to be a little bit of a lean towards comedy, I don't really think step on each other's toes when it comes to their strengths. They represent different storylines in the show, like redemption, underdog storylines, overdog storylines, I guess. They hit a lot of the major skills like fashion, makeup, dancing, singing, theatrics, and while there could be another 4 people that fit these categories better, when I mention Drag Race, I think these 4 people will be brought up a lot. But it's interesting to see how things change over time, so you don't know what something like this will look like in like 2 to 3 years. Will a queen that hasn't even been on the show pop in? Will Serena Chacha finally make it to the top 4? These are questions that we need to know. This is all for fun, so again, comment your picks down below and give a reasoning. Thank you so much for watching, you're the best, and I'll see you soon with another video.